even if it's just sharing your work that maybe is rough around the edges, that is how a lot of us improve. And I think people, my worry is that a lot of people feel that the penalty for failure is much higher than it actually is.
Welcome to the Long Game Podcast. My name's George Bafalukos. In this podcast, we'll be taking a deep dive into the world of game audio. Join us as we explore the careers, challenges, and triumphs of the professionals who craft the sounds that bring our favorite games to life. Before I start this episode, I've got some bittersweet news. Anthony has landed his dream position at Blizzard working on World of Warcraft, and I couldn't be happier for him. But unfortunately, due to the time commitment of this new position, he's not going to be able to continue the podcast for the foreseeable future. Everybody please wish Anthony the very best moving forward, and I'm sure we'll have him on soon to catch up. That being said, today's guest is Nathan Moody. Nathan is a jack of all trades, and including his resume in a short intro will be difficult, so I'm only going to include the games. To name a few, he's a freelance sound designer currently working with Skywalker Sound. He's done sound design for the Callisto Protocol, What If, an Immersive Story, and Pentiment, as well as mastering for the official soundtracks for Oxenfree, Guild Wars 2, and Firmament. Throughout our conversation, we talk about pivoting to audio after already establishing a successful career in interactive media, his attitude and reasoning behind being a generalist, his initial interest in eurorack synths, and being an invaluable resource in the audio community. All right. Well, after a little bit of a hiatus, we're back, and today we're joined by Nathan Moody. How's it going, Nathan?
It's going well. How about yourself?
Going well. Can't complain. But yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. We've been talking online on Twitter and things like that for years now, but this is the first time actually meeting you face to face. So it's really exciting.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Oh, anytime. It's my pleasure. So yeah, we usually just start off with a, little intro about who you are, where you're from, what you're up to. So floor is yours.
Well, I grew up in a pack of wolves in the northern woods of Maine, and somehow eventually found myself into an art program in university, and then moved to the West Coast to start working in interactive media. So I've been in the San Francisco Bay Area since then. So pretty long time, worked on everything from interactive installations to CD-ROMs to websites to museum exhibits. And all of that led to me picking up field recording first as a hobby and synthesis as an interest and kind of my main musical instrument. And now I work as a sound designer and sound professional for games and film.
That's awesome. I was kind of wanting to mention that. I listened to you on Akasha's podcast, and that was mainly focused on you kind of pivoting to sound designing later in life and after you've already built a whole career. And that's just something you don't hear too often. Like, it's pretty remarkable. It seems you've had great success in both,
I'm really lucky to have spent my whole career being able to pivot based on where my passions and interests are, because I've always been kind of a generalist. So that's made those pivots a little bit easier. But I know that in our industry, one person who has a similar story is Katrina Amsler from Denmark, and she switched over into professional audio pretty late in her career and life path relative to most who go to school for audio and sound and then start working in audio and sound.
Right.
And so our paths are similar, and it's been really inspiring to me to hear stories from others who have made that switch, because it makes me feel less crazy for doing so. And it's validating that it doesn't matter how old you are. It matters how old you feel. I'm mentally 14 years old still and have been since I was 14 years old. So I just basically don't tend to have good eyesight for barriers. I just kind of go. And sometimes that creates challenges, but I think every challenge is just a design problem waiting to be untangled and solved.
Absolutely. I think to be successful in this industry, you kind of have to have that disregard for the barriers just because of how difficult it can be to break in. That's the whole reason why I called this show The Long Game. It's just, it took me a long time to really find my footing. And yeah, just like coming from an entirely different discipline. I mean, not entirely different. You're still working in some sort of media, but yeah, it's a different kind of can of worms. And yeah, it is very inspiring. And yeah, that's something I wanted to touch on. And also you being a generalist, I was wondering if that was something that you intended to do, or is that just kind of how things shook out in the end?
No, I've always been that way. That definitely was not any sort of career strategy. I've always been interested in lots of things. And when I was a kid, as I mentioned, I went to school and was an art major. And one of the media that I liked the most was comics and graphic novels because it was this synthesis of writing and pacing and editing and drawing and painting, and it was all of these things rolled up into one. And that's why I always liked films, because I was always really into production design and concept art. And I've always been into deeply, deeply multidisciplinary forms of media. And so, because of those interests and the interest in how all of those things interconnect and feed off of one another and create this amazing, much greater sum than its parts, that's, I think, what naturally led me to be a generalist, have this broad range of interests, and wanting to work in disciplines where I would have to work with people from outside of my discipline to be successful.
Absolutely. I'm not sure, but I would assume that like if you are able to actually get proficient in all of those different skills like you are, that would really help you just in your career, kind of being able to, when one thing slows down, you can kind of move over to this, being it. I know you did music mastering for years, or you could work on a documentary, or you could work on a video game, or you could do Foley. Like, I mean, not everybody has all of those skill sets to be able to do those pivots. They're all very particular and have their own nuance. So, I mean, like, I can only imagine that helped you in the long run.
It did. I'm not sure I would be. I'm not sure I'd characterize it though as me having this like incredibly deep quiver of skills. I think it's just me having this insatiable curiosity about other disciplines and wanting to understand how they work at a very deep level. And I think that interest has just led me to become simply a fast learner, which itself is a career skill
Absolutely.
in a lot of ways. You know, when I start learning about a project, or I'm working on a project and I'm working with, a director of photography on an independent film, I'm desperately interested to hear how they think about shooting and what is informing their process, because I'm not a cinematographer. I don't want to be one. But if I can understand what's inspiring them to make certain decisions, I want that same problem frame so that I can base my decisions around the same themes and principles. And so I think a lot of that just comes from, again, wanting to understand how people work, how other people think, so that we can have kind of a shared, not just shared vision of the project, but also a shared ethos of how the work gets done. And in my experience, that's really kind of been one of the big temperature gauges that I look for in terms of like, is a team going to be cohesive and fun to work with?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think that particularly applies in video games. Like, as a sound designer, you really want to get to know kind of like how the animators are working, or how VFX is being triggered, or the level art. Like, how are you assigning the materials to drive these switches that we're making? So, I mean, yeah. 100%. You'd really need to be able to speak the other department's language, at least to some degree, so you can kind of work together, lift each other up.
Absolutely. Like I coded for a while. I was trying to make my own game, and I reached this kind of like speed of light, infinite hockey stick of effort to get better, and I was bad. And like, my forward progress like stalled super fast. And so what I realized was, at least now, I can say I've done it. I understand what's easy and what's hard. I understand object-oriented principles. I can read code fairly decently, but I'm just not going to look for opportunities that will put me in a situation where I have to write code anymore. And it was like this weight lifted off my shoulders, but yet I walked away from that experience with a much healthier respect and understanding for that discipline, and I would argue art form. And it's made my communications with devs a whole lot easier.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was first getting into game audio, I built like a tech demo type thing, and it was like a little first person shooter. There was not much to it at all. It had like NPCs that would turn towards you and shoot. And when they shot you, it would deal damage and vice versa. But the fact that I even went through the process of building it from scratch rather than using, some like Unreal sample game that's pre-made just gave me a way better understanding of actually like what goes on under the hood, like the actual like the ground level, like, okay, what is making this happen? And that's once you know that and you know how to hook on to it, you just become like a lot more helpful in the development process, I think, more
Yeah,
informed.
100% agree. 100% agree.
So that kind of leads me to my first question that I wrote down. I was just curious about that. But the first thing I was wondering about is just like, so you're going to school for art, you're interested in comics and stuff, and then you go into interactive media. Like, what exactly was it like? And this could be when you were 5 years old or when you were 30. It doesn't really matter. But what was like the first thing that really caught your eye when it came to sound, or was it music, or how did that start to manifest?
I don't know. I think for me it was having this sense of audio as control over time. So when I was a child, my first memory of recording technology of any kind was I was sitting on my dad's lap. He was playing guitar. I was singing horribly because I was like 3 years old, and we were recording it on a reel to reel. And I would be able to listen back to that. And later I dumped that onto cassette. And I just realized I had this perfect memory recall of listening to that. And like when you're 3 up to around 4, like it's really hard for you to build memories that stick at that age. And so I have almost no memory of my life during that period except that moment. And I can remember exactly what room we were in and the color of the carpet and all of that stuff. So that left a big impression on me. And then fast forward a bit to kind of high school, I was doing a lot of like weird collage work, just with recordings off of the radio, with a dual cassette deck. And so I do these, really rough, like punch in, punch out kind of collage tapes, and I share them with my friends, mostly as for humor value. But that's when I started to really understand juxtaposition of recontextualized audio and how that could erase its original meaning and impart this completely different layer of meaning on it. Of course, I'm of an age where I saw the original Star Wars in the theater. And then, of course, over the years, of course, I knew who Ben Burt was and how just industry and culture changing the sound of Star Wars was. But it wasn't until I actually watched all of the extended edition supplemental material for the Lord of the Rings DVDs that I saw myself in those other sound designers. They were my age and they were doing this amazing stuff and they were having a blast and they were experimenting, this great sense of play. And that's when I started to realize I should pick up field recording. At the time, I'm like, oh, I want to do field recording like they do, but for my own music. And because I've been a musician most of my life. But the more I did it, the more I understood how these things could fit into like a actual media project. And so that started to become an interest. Never imagined I'd be able to do that for a living. But on every interactive project I was working on, I became like the sound person who would do all the sound design or manage the composer or implement the sounds. And so that's where things really started to take a more professional sheen.
That's incredible. So you were really just kind of doing it as a hobby, and then just because you were more aware than the others that you were on the project with in your old career, you just ended up kind of assuming that role.
Yeah, absolutely. And because it was an interest of mine, I was the first to propose that there be sound in an exhibit. And so, we had a great kind of technical producer who would get samples of hardware and we'd try, those sound shower focused parabolic speakers and all these different audio tech. And so it was a really interesting approach to doing interactive audio, but in a spatial environment, with light trigger sensors and ultrasonic proximity sensors and all that kind of stuff. So that was really my first deep education in terms of sound reproduction in an interactive sense, was in the physical world versus the world of a game.
That's so cool. Did you end up using any like middleware? Did you use Wise or Fmod or anything in those installations so that it wasn't like one looping audio file, or was that, I'm not sure when this was all taking place or if that was even around, but I know that they do that some kind of stuff nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, we started working in Unity a little bit, but the tooling for Unreal was really raw at the time, and a lot of what we did a lot of data visualization and real-time particle physics and stuff like that. So we needed to be pretty close to the metal So having a whole game engine in between the data and the pixels showing up on screen, there was a whole lot of cruft there that we just couldn't afford in terms of performance. And plus, we're building things that have to run 24/7, 365. And so sometimes the machine spec needed to be either limited or the machine spec was super huge because we're driving, a 4x8 grid of 1080p screens. So at that point, it's just about particle count and pixel count, and there's only so much programming cruft in the middle between what the data is and what the visual output is and the interactive output is, that we wound up just coding a lot of that stuff by hand and doing custom solutions for a lot of that.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, I was just curious. I did an internship right out of college, and there's this it's like an experience bar, I guess you would call it. I forget the name, Undertow or something like that. It's basically like a pirate ship theme bar. And the guy that I did the internship, Sam, he did all of the sound design for like the immersive experience. So like you kind of go into this pirate ship and there's like little portholes and you can see waves kind of lapping up against the windows and thunder crashing and all of this stuff. And I went to visit him a while back and he kind of showed me what he was working on. I was like, that's cool. You could really use some middleware for this though. So you don't have to have a 2-hour rain loop going, But it's kind of like,
seriously,
they let people in, like there's like only so many tables in the bar and it's like you can be in here for an hour or 2 hours, whatever it is. And the experience is timed to that. So like when the lightning would crash, there'd be big thunder and, it all kind of syncs up to their experience. But yeah, that's just what made me think of that.
No, totally. I mean, back when I was doing it, everything was just duct tape and baling wire. It was raw. There were a couple of frameworks out there, like Touch Designer was around, and we used that a few times. But if we were to do that now, we would totally be using probably Unreal and Wise.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. So yeah, the next thing I kind of wanted to touch on is, I'd be remiss if I did not mention that giant wall of Eurorack behind you. You've been involved with like modular synthesis as long as I've been aware of you, and that's quite a while now. So I'm just curious kind of what kind of got you into that and why you went more analog rather than digital, like what the thought process was there.
I would reframe that and suggest that I went physical instead of virtual, because a lot of the modules in my Eurorack modular synth in my studio are digital.
Oh,
and
okay.
I love them. They sound amazing. But I was finding that using commercial fixed architecture synths were not letting me get crazy enough. Like, I've always been a music maker and I've always liked the extremes, from extreme calm to extreme not calm.
Right.
So, very calming to very aggressive. And like, that's just my musical taste. And that of course shapes the kind of music that I make. So I was writing an article for my blog in 2009, 2010, and the topic was prosumerism, which nowadays people think it means like halfway between professional and consumer. And its original meaning was from Alvin Toffler, where it actually means producer/consumer. And it's very much the economy we find ourselves in now, with makers who are making things for other makers because of 3D printing and stuff like that. And I reached out to some folks that I knew asking, like, what are examples in music technology? And it was Richard Devine who said, you should look up this guy called the Harvestman, and he makes these modules for synthesizers. And so Richard Devine tipped me off to the whole Eurorack world, which was largely musicians making their own hardware and selling their hardware to other musicians. The true kind of prosumerism model in its original sense. And so that was the first clue I was given that this was a thing that was still done outside of like the big Moog 5U systems in the 70s. And so I started to research it. I started to listen to work done with these tools, and I'm like, this is unhinged. It's timbrely stuff I've not heard done before, and that interests me. And then when I started to get into it and I realized, oh, you know what? I have two hands, yet I can't use two mice at the same time on a computer. So all of a sudden for me, not only did the tactile approach of knobs and wires, of course, lead to different results because the process is different, but I found it was immediate and fast because I could use two hands at all times. And that's why when I do mastering, I've a fully analog, all hardware-based mastering chain in my desk because I can move two EQ knobs at the same time, which I cannot do in a plugin. And so for me, just I realized this is largely how my brain works. And this is how I feel efficient and how I feel inspired. And it absolutely does not sound better than anything I would do on the computer. It just is different. And it's that difference that's always interested me, is how does this workflow influence the outcome of my artistic product? And it's, for me, I have felt that it has been a net benefit in that regard.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's so cool that Richard Devine was the one that put you onto Eurorack. That's amazing. What a story.
He has more Eurorack than my house has walls.
Yeah, I mean, geez, like his setup has got to cost more than most people's houses. Like it just takes up, he doesn't have it in cases anymore. It's just all on the floor.
Totally. Well, I mean, him and Heinbach, those are hardware aficionados that have more than one studio in their house.
Right.
So they have a studio A and a studio B, and I think now a studio C, which is awesome. And a lot of people couldn't deal with that kind of complexity or that range of literally unlimited options. You know, that's anathema to how a lot of people like to create. And so I think it's really cool that these tools aren't for everybody, but there is a tool for everybody. It's just a matter of what form that takes and what fires up the inspiration and what reduces friction.
Yeah.
And those are the only two factors I think that matter in terms of what tools we choose.
100%. Yeah, I mean, I've kind of stumbled upon Eurorack. I didn't even realize how big of a deal this was, but I went to this like modular meetup just out of curiosity in Phoenix, and Audio Damage had this whole booth there. He had a rack of just Audio Damage modules, and he was just letting people patch in, and I had no idea what I was doing. I'm just like, okay, what's the gate do? Like, I was just trying to figure out, and he kind of walked me through it and helped me like put a little drum patch together and run it through reverb, and I was just immediately hooked. The second I just patched in and turned some knobs and heard it immediately, I was just like, okay, how much does this stuff cost? And I'm gonna have to start saving up, because this was before like VCV rack or anything. There was not really any digital option.
No, I mean, I would argue the only digital option was actually Propeller Head's Reason.
Right, because you could flip it over, and then there was the kind of modular back end. Yeah.
Like that was the closest that anyone came at that time. And it's funny you mentioned Audio Damage, because Chris Randall, who runs Audio Damage, used to be in a band called Sister Machine Gun. So yet another example of prosumerism.
That's awesome.
And his band was part of the scene I was in the 90s, kind of like the industrial and industrial metal scene. So I've been aware of Chris for years. And then all of a sudden I'm like, Audio Damage, that sounds like a cool company. And I read about them. I'm like, wait, that Chris Randall?
I know. And he still makes amazing plugins, but I think they shut down the modular end, and I'm still kind of looking for that reverb. What is it? EOS? I'm just looking on reverb.com, just seeing if one pops up, if anybody's selling it, because it sounds amazing.
Yeah, I've got a bunch of Audio Damage modules and plugins. Like Quanta is really, really fun. And even his older compressor Rough Rider is still like really simple and just sounds gnarly, and it's so fun.
Yeah, it's just quick. Like I like a quick compressor, and I use that all the time, and that was free. So I've just been using that for quite a while. But wow,
totally.
What a small world. That's cool. I'm wondering, do you remember your first module, or what your first little case? Because I can't imagine you started with the wall back there.
Oh heavens no. Yeah, I remember it perfectly. It was rest in peace, Paul Schreiber, but it was a Synthesis Technologies Morphing Terrarium wavetable synth. So one of my first modules was completely digital: Make Noise Maths and Make Noise Pressure Points and Mutable Instruments Braids. That was like my first very, very small system. And what I liked about that system, and still do, and this also applies to other non-modular instruments that I buy, is I loved having a little modular that I actually had to touch and play for it to do anything. So I got the sense that I was really performing with it, as opposed to just lighting up a sequence and stuff like that, which I do all the time, of course. But that really stuck with me. And so I'm a big fan of also the Seat Lombard line of synths, which are all wooden synths. And that's how they work. You have to touch them in order to make sound. And so they're highly performative, and you really can't sequence a lot of them.
Sure.
And again, like that's the good kind of friction. It puts you in a place of slight discomfort so that you kind of have to elevate your game a little bit in order to make something that satisfies you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I started building mine, I was making a lot of electronic music at the time, and I kind of built it more for music. Like I started off with like a Metropolis, the A110 Doepfer oscillator, the Wasp filter, and then just like a IntelliGel quad VCA and an envelope. So like I could do quite a bit just with that little setup. And then I just kind of found as I got more into sound design, I'm just like, I don't really need to sequence anything for this, And I still have it. Like I bought a little smaller IntelliGel case just for like outboard processing recently. That's actually what I reached out to you about, ask you about this podcast. But yeah, I've still got all my music stuff. I have like all the Roland 808 drums or 909 drums and stuff. But now this is pretty much just a sound design like source machine. I'll get like long recordings and then mess with it. I have that like, what is it? Planar. So I kind of have like a way to control multiple, like a macro. I love that thing. So I'll get like really complex movement, big long recording, and then I'll chuck it through Traveler, some granular plugins. And then that ends up kind of going into the library as a starting point, which has been super helpful.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, my main case that takes up a good chunk of my room, it gets reconfigured. Like I have drawers and drawers and drawers of unused modules at this point. And so sometimes it goes more towards music making. Right now it's very much in a sound design mode.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know. It's a matter of both possibility and limitations, of course. I used to also own a Buchla system, and the
nice.
Buchla modules are interesting because you can't mix and match voltage and audio. They're completely different pathways with different voltages. They don't talk to one another at all. And at first, that coming from Eurorack, that seems really limiting because it's like, ooh, I'm just going to use a cluck pulse as like my sound source, and you can do weird stuff like that. But the way the Buchla is designed, every modulator can operate at audio rate. So you don't have to worry so much about like feeding it a voltage. Just have it do a thing that's really, really fast, and you can route that stuff without it feeling like a limitation. But that also is why the timbres out of the Buchla are so utterly unique, and they sound so different than the stuff coming out of Eurorack or 5U Moog-based systems.
Yeah, I've never encountered a Buchla in person. I really was interested in it, especially that kind of unpredictability, but it's just expensive.
They're very expensive. But you know what? One thing that it reminds you of is that functional density is not everything. And there's this trend in the Eurorack format to make modules smaller and smaller and smaller. And I've been in the game long enough that I have now found modules that are literally too small to be usable.
Like the 2HP stuff?
Well, the 2HP stuff is not functionally that complex. So sometimes those things work really well. It's usually when you have like a complex oscillator in 8U and it has a bunch of modes on it. And for me, modes and memorizing key combos, it's like, that's what a DAW does. I don't want my synthesizer to force me to remember all of this stuff too. And so anything that has modes or a menu more than one level deep has been excised from all of my racks. I just don't have the patience at the time.
That's kind of like why you get into Eurorack anyway, too, to kind of get away from the computer and the menus. I mean, at least me personally, the only one that I have with a screen on it is Pamela's New Workout, and that's it. And that's just an awesome clock and, kind
totally.
of like trigger
and,
source.
And its menus, I think its menu structure is only one deep.
So it's two. It's
lots of pages. No, You're right. It's two levels, lots of pages in each level, but it's very shallow from a UX standpoint.
Absolutely.
And that's, I think, why that module is so successful.
Yeah, and you get 8 gate outputs. It's pretty great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. I guess that does kind of lead into my next question. Along with doing Foley and doing music mastering and video game audio and everything else that you make sound libraries and you make a lot of them. I'm wondering how you manage that time. And then, yeah, just piggybacking off of the modular, you released Analog Ordnance, and that is an incredible library. And that's
Oh, thank
all
you.
modular from front to back, from what I understand, right?
Yes, it's all modular. It's mostly analog. I had to break the rules and use like two digital modules, one from noise engineering and one from synthesis technology. But it's also mastered in the analog domain as well. So basically, it's like zero plugins used to make anything in that library, including limiting. And again, that was just not because I think it's better. It just made the project of interest to me, and I wanted to challenge myself, like how what kind of aesthetic is that going to enforce on the work, and can that still be a useful aesthetic for myself and others? And I've got other libraries in the quote unquote analog series already planned, and one of them's underway right now. That'll be the same thing, all completely hardware based, almost entirely analog sound sources and analog mastering, just so that the texture is cohesive amongst that series.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I haven't picked up the full yet, but I listened to the sampler that you put out, which was extremely extensive. I couldn't believe that you released such a big sampler for that library. But just from what I've heard was, I mean, it's thick, it's chunky, it's powerful, and the like actual like tonal content of it, I mean, it is a great resource for anybody that's trying to do anything relatively sci-fi, I think.
Oh, well, thanks for the kind words. It was really fun to make, and it was really challenging because one of the things I also wanted to do was create mechanism layers, and doing that digitally is really hard. And one of the games that came out recently that I have a just infinite respect for on the synthesis side of things is Cocoon, because Cocoon, even the Foley is synthesized, and they just went so deep with that kind of stuff. And having done it now myself, I absolutely understand how hard that is. And that is also why the next project I did was like all small mechanism sounds, just from actual recordings, because the two paired, I thought, really, really well together. But
That
that's a lot
that
of
library
how.
I have picked up, Micromech, and it is probably the most utilitarian. Like, I mean, I use it all the time.
Oh, that's awesome.
I mean, truly, and I know that like my coworkers do as well. Like, you need those little clicks, and like it's just very like very very applicable to almost everything. So, thank you very much for putting that together.
Oh, you bet. It's so good to hear. But that's how a lot of these ideas for my libraries come about. Is like, what do I need?
Right.
What's missing in my library? And so once I got Analog Ordnance finished, I'm just like, the mech sounds I introduced in that are interesting, but it's not gonna satisfy if I want like an actual, bolt being pulled back or a magazine being ejected. And I'm like, well, I need to make more of that stuff. And that got me on this whole thing of like, ooh, could I make big chunky sounds out of extremely small objects, and making sure that none of them have motors. It's all just kind of
Tactile.
physical. Yeah, tactile, non-motorized. And so that was just kind of I had a need, and it turned into a library, and it turned out to be useful for other people. So yeah, it's just my interests in terms of sound libraries. Just sometimes they're personal expressions, like my Sigil library, which is all electroacoustic instruments that I made by hand in order to make sounds. That was just a passion project. And then that turned into some other things that I did, where I took the modular and ran it through a transducer into just piles of metal that I stacked on top of the transducer. That one's called Metallotronic. And so it's like a synthesis, metal rattle kind of hybrid library. So sound libraries are this interesting middle ground for me between personal expression and trying to fulfill a market need. And when the two overlap, sometimes it's a Venn diagram of two non-overlapping circles. But sometimes there's almost complete overlap, and those are the projects that I do that become sound libraries.
That makes total sense because it is such a saturated market. I mean, anybody can release a sound library to any quality degree. I mean, there's some not so great ones out there, but I mean, you're allowed to put them out. So finding your way kind of like amongst all of the other people releasing these, I mean, yeah, you have to be intentional about it, I'd imagine. Otherwise, it's just going to be a lot of work for very little result.
Yeah, you should never make a sound library if money is your goal. that is that is not how you pay the mortgage. I know most of the field recordists and like library folks on the planet, and I think I can count on less than one hand those people who make a living full time off library work. So what I do is I think as I've gotten older, I've now got this attitude of I'm not so much interested anymore in making finished products that are mine that I can point at and say that is exactly my work. I'm now much more interested in making other people's work better. And so through that lens, all of a sudden, like sound libraries makes a lot of sense. Mastering makes a lot of sense. Implementing other people's work makes a lot of sense. Editing Foley makes a lot of sense. So like those are the kind of support roles I'm increasingly kind of almost more interested in than saying like that's my weapon sound, which happens, that's cool. That's my superhero power sound in whatever game, and that happens. But I don't get that electric charge of like, ooh, I feel like I've contributed to someone else's work. That's really exciting to me.
Well, that's beautiful. I mean, that's a great place to be. Like that's what gets you excited. It's like, oh wow, somebody's using this and they used it in this game. Like it, and I relate to that. I've not made a library. I've been meaning to for years. And that kind of leads me to like, how do you have time for this amongst all the other things that you do? Because it's not a small undertaking, like the metadata alone.
No, some of it's underemployment. So we're in the entertainment industry, or at least I am, and films and games, if you're lucky, being a service provider like I am. Let's clarify one other thing. I'm not in-house anywhere. So I don't work for a game studio. I work for filmmakers and game makers as an audio service provider. So try as I might, there's always gaps in between projects. Well, often are, I shouldn't say always. And when there's a gap, my just mental frame for that is I still have a job. I'm just not working for anybody else right now. And so my job is to spend 8 hours a day concepting and executing things that I can use to generate revenue and help other people. So with that mindset, like I don't have a lot of wasted time in my schedule. I'm always working on something. But the other answer to your question is having a highly repeatable process for how the library work gets done. And I don't mean the design or the recording. Like that's going to take the time it's going to take. I mean, like, what is the process from session is over to dumping the files to then editing, metadata, polish, package, document, all that stuff. And I've got this really, really finely honed system now where once all the recording or designing or gathering is done, I'm now finally nine libraries in. Finally, I've got a really repeatable system for cranking all that stuff out relatively quickly. And so just having a process or having developed a process for that is also really important.
Yeah, I'd imagine so. I mean, so could you go into what that briefly entails? I mean, you don't have to spoil any, like trade secrets, obviously, but just what makes it a little bit smoother for you?
Well, it's again, it's about limitations. So I create rules for myself. And one of the rules that I've created is, of course, you can't do this if you're doing an expedition where all you're doing is recording and then you bring this mountain of stuff back and then you have to sort through it all. But if I'm doing more kind of studio-based or prop-based libraries, I have a rule where after a recording session is done, I have to do all the editing and all the metadata before I'm allowed to do another recording session. And what that allows me to do is, again, kind of going back to adopting the rules of other disciplines. I'm thinking about a sound library as a piece of software. And so I have this always be shippable mindset where if I get hit by a truck tomorrow, I could release this library that's not maybe complete, but what's in it is shippable. It's ready to go. And so I find that doing that allows me to just work until I feel like, okay, you know what? The inspiration's starting to fizzle. It's harder for me to kind of come up with an idea for another recording session. I feel like I'm reaching resolution on this library. And it just allows me to just kind of like pull the plug whenever I want or keep going for as long as I want. And I also use the word resolution really carefully. Like, I don't ever ask myself if something is complete. I never aim for completion. I aim for resolution. And the difference is, have I made sure that I have not abdicated any responsibilities or kicked any cans down the road? Have I answered all the questions and done all the tasks that I need to do to make something presentable to somebody else, whether it's an album? It's like, is this resolved enough for someone to make something of this piece of music or this body of work or this sound library? And so, and then the other one is just becoming extremely conversant with SoundMiner. I've been using SoundMiner for like 15 years at this point, and I love its workflow system. So I've got all these scripts and workflows that I've developed over the years that just makes ingest into the library super easy. I also spend an inordinate amount of time looking through the sounds I purchase from other library makers and seeing how they do metadata. And so I've got kind of my own metadata house rules for how that goes down. So there's never like should it be this? Should it be that? It's like, no, I've got a pattern now and I've got a standard, and it, largely follows, Kai Paquin's metadata best practices, and it's all UCS compliant and all that other good stuff. But just having those questions answered for myself in terms of how I want metadata applied, there's no guesswork in terms of formatting anymore.
Yeah. I mean, I found when I like first started like organizing my sound library, my original recordings was so difficult. I'm just like, how do you categorize this? And it was just like really, really daunting. So yeah, if you have kind of like a framework that you've established on your own that makes sense to you, so you can quickly find whatever you're looking for, I think that's tremendous advice. And doing the metadata and the editing before you can record again, that's genius. Because I have a raw recording folder and I don't even know what's in there anymore. I got to go digging through it. Like,
See, this is the albatross that hangs around all of our necks, right? Like, that's,
yeah,
everyone's got the infamous _ sort folder in their
exactly.
directory. And that just, like, it keeps me up at night. It bugs me that there's like more than 3 files in there.
Yeah, 100%. I know there's stuff in there that would be very useful, and I'm just like, I gotta put some time aside for that among all the other things going on all the time. And that's another segue into another question I had, and it's more about just you as a person. Like I said in the beginning, like I've been kind of like talking with you on and off on Twitter and on different, websites for years at this point. And you've always been extremely generous. Even when I had nothing going on, I was just starting. You were always very kind, very generous with your time. I find that you're that way just in general online, but you are extremely active online. I mean, maybe it's just my nature. I'm kind of like a lurker online. I don't engage as much as I should. But I mean, you're always talking to everybody about everything. And you're a great resource, as like, you just know a lot about a lot. So whenever you're talking about something, even if it's with somebody else, I'll usually check in. But like, what's the impetus behind that? And how do you stay so active in the community?
All I'm doing is I'm remembering the kindnesses extended to me by other people when I was starting. That's it. It's that simple. I was on a forum in the late 2000s called Social Sound Design. And it was a great site. It was very kind of Stack Exchange like, where it was less of a forum and more of you can upvote questions or upvote answers. And I think that simple mechanic made it great for people like me who are maybe enthusiastic hobbyists. If I asked well-considered questions, I would get the same respect that other people would get for providing insightful answers. And so you expand that out to a broader community. I don't know how many thousands of sound designers were on that site at this point, but it's been defunct for many years. But it created this kind of even playing field where there was this complete mix of people who were at the top of their game in film and games, and people who were just starting out and didn't know what they didn't know. And I'm still in that didn't know what they didn't know camp, for the record. And it created this really like level playing field where no one felt dumb for asking a question. If you asked a great question, people were like, damn, yeah, great question. And so the kindness extended to me and the patience with my questions and my inquiries is just something that I've felt like I've wanted to pay back. And that's just all it is. or maybe I'm just a loudmouth. I don't know. I don't know, George.
I don't think it's
But
that. No, I think you're giving back, like you said, and it's like very evident. And I can tell you, like personally, like when I was still trying to get my feet in the door, like even you just kind of being like, "Oh, this is awesome!" Like a redesign I shared, or I remember in particular, the first thing I ever worked on was this Final Fantasy project. It was a fan project called Memoria Project, and I released it when it came out. I shared it on Twitter, and you're just like, "Whoa, what was your role in this?" And just by happenstance, I put the most time in out of the team. They gave me the lead credit. So the first thing I ever did was lead sound designer. It's just kind of weird. Like, yeah, I mean, it was just like really refreshing, and it just gave me like a good jolt forward. I'm just like, oh, like Nathan thinks this is cool. It must be pretty cool, you know?
I actually remember the Memorial Project. I remember that posting, even to
That's
this
awesome.
day. And yeah, it's just, yeah, I also just really try to be careful and like never say what I don't mean, you know? So I don't
Totally.
comment on redesigns that often, but when I do, it's because something's really grabbed me and is really interesting. And I think another thing people need to understand about interacting with others online is that if someone does have criticisms, if they're delivered in a respectful way, the underlying meaning there is that whatever they're commenting on, they clearly think it has value, or they're not going to waste their time giving you feedback, right?
100%.
So even if someone's just like gives you a whole bunch of bulleted, constructive criticism, if it's done respectfully, they like the work. They're engaged with the work. That's what those bullet points mean. And this is just
Exactly.
a shopping list of things for you to make it better. Everyone who gets that kind of feedback should take that as a huge compliment.
100%. Yeah. And I mean, and the time it takes for somebody to be critical of something that you've worked on is not trivial. Like to write like thoughtful, concise feedback that takes time. And yeah, if they're
Yeah,
taking that time
totally.
for you, then it's something that you should cherish and you should take action on, I think.
Absolutely. And like I was in that same position myself, and people would give me, professionals that I admire would give me feedback and just like, you clearly watched this thing more than 5 times to pick up on some of these details. And it's just like you made it an investment in time and attention. And those two things are everyone's most valuable assets. So I think everyone online needs to remember, like, when that is given to you, that is such a gift.
Absolutely. I don't know where I would have been. I've said it on this show before, but I was a little bit too precious when I was starting out about sharing things that I didn't feel like were done or were like up to snuff. And I kind of shot myself in the foot with that thinking, because I could have gotten a lot further had I just shared something, even if it wasn't, I wasn't super proud of it, because I would get that feedback that would have helped me get there faster rather than spinning my wheels by myself.
Yeah, and that's everyone has a different risk tolerance when it comes to being vulnerable in a public forum, especially. And so, for people like me, I mean, I honestly think it's more learned than innate, though. I think almost everything is learned versus, I'm much more of a nurture versus nature kind of philosophy kind of person. I think I've just done it enough to realize that when I put something out that is not up to snuff or gets withering feedback or is not my best work, like no one's going to tar and feather me and put me in the public square, laugh at me. They're going to maybe give me some things like, man, it didn't work for me. And they're going to forget about me and go about the rest of their lives, which they should do. And that's just happened to me enough that's just like, oh, if I put something out there and I'm wrong, no one's gonna die. I'm not gonna have to crawl under a rock for 5 years and no one's ever gonna hire me again. Like, it doesn't work that way. It just
Yeah.
doesn't. It works that way if people are disingenuous, if people are not respectful with criticisms and feedback. So yes, that can happen. But if you're of good character and you're doing something out of goodwill, like even if it's just sharing your work that maybe is rough around the edges, that is how a lot of us improve. And I think people, my worry is that a lot of people feel that the penalty for failure is much higher than it actually is.
Yeah. And I think it's just this weird thing in this digital age of, yeah, how you're perceived. I guess, especially amongst people that you admire and like, but yeah, I think if I could, any advice I could give anybody, it's just, yeah, exactly like what you said. You're not going to be shamed. You're not going to be tarred and feathered. You're not going to be criticized. especially not in the game audio community. Like, people are so kind and generous, and they're really just trying to help, because we all know how difficult it is to get the ball rolling. So it's like, put yourself out there, take the plunge. It's worth it. I think you'll benefit
Yep,
from it.
totally. And I think everyone just always needs to remember, no matter how long you're in the audio industry, especially, like, no one has it all figured out. Nobody. You know, we're all still figuring it out as we go through it and as we do it. And I think that's one of the reasons why, especially the game industry, is so open and welcoming and willing to share knowledge.
Absolutely. Well, I think, we're about at that time, and I think that's a great place to call it. How about you?
That sounds great.
Right on. Well, thanks again so much, Nathan. Really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me here. It's really nice to meet you. And yeah, no, really can't thank you enough.
Oh, it was completely my pleasure. Thank you so much for the chance to chat.
Oh, anytime. All right. See you later, guys.